August 8th, 1880, Kabul, Afghanistan. 6 weeks earlier, a British brigade had been destroyed in open battle. Nearly 1,200 men dead in a single afternoon. The survivors had stumbled back into Kandahar, and now the city was surrounded. London wanted answers. India wanted a rescue, and someone had to march 320 miles through the Afghan summer to get there. General Frederick Roberts looked at the map. Then he looked at his soldiers. He had 23 days. He had no heavy guns, no wheeled transport, nothing but 10,000 men, and the best army Britain had ever put into the field. Could they make it in time? This is Kandahar. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the campaign where General Roberts led 10,000 men across Afghanistan in the height of summer, destroyed an army that had humiliated Britain 6 weeks earlier, and restored the honour of the empire in a single afternoon. But before we get to that afternoon, we need to understand what made this march necessary, and what had gone so terribly wrong 6 weeks before. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. Don't miss them. To understand Kandahar, you must first understand Maiwand. And to understand Maiwand, you must understand what Britain was doing in Afghanistan in 1880. The Second Anglo-Afghan War had begun in 1878, driven by British anxiety about Russian expansion toward India. Afghanistan was the buffer, the country that had to remain in the British sphere of influence, or the road to India lay open. After 2 years of campaigning, Britain had achieved what looked like a workable settlement. Abdur Rahman Khan was recognised as Emir in Kabul. The main British force under Roberts had already completed a successful campaign in the north. It looked, in the summer of 1880, as if the war was effectively over. Ayub Khan had other ideas. The governor of Herat, and a rival claimant to the Afghan throne, Ayub Khan raised an army of regulars and tribal fighters and marched south. His target was Kandahar, the great city of southern Afghanistan, held by a British garrison under General Primrose. To stop him, Brigadier General Burrows marched out from Kandahar with approximately 2,500 men. On July 27th, 1880, at a village called Maiwand, Burrows ran into Ayub Khan's full strength. The figures tell the story simply enough. 2,500 British and Indian soldiers against an army that outnumbered them 10-1, supported by modern Armstrong artillery that outranged anything Burrows had brought. In the July heat, with water running short, the British line broke. The 66th Berkshire Regiment was almost annihilated, fighting rearguard actions to cover the retreat. Of the 2,500 men who marched out of Kandahar, nearly 1,200 were dead by the time the survivors stumbled back inside the city walls. Maiwand was the worst British defeat in Afghanistan since the catastrophe of 1842. Ayub Khan had destroyed a British brigade in open battle. Now he closed around Kandahar, and General Primrose's garrison of 4,000 men waited behind mud walls 30 feet high while the relief column decided what to do. In Kabul, Roberts made his decision quickly. 2 routes were available. General Fair could march up from Quetta in the south, but Fair was struggling with his own logistics, and his timeline was uncertain. Roberts looked at the map, looked at the calendar, and decided. He would march from Kabul himself. He would take his best soldiers, the ones who had already proved themselves in the north, and he would move fast enough that Primrose's garrison could hold until he arrived. There was one constraint that Roberts understood completely. Speed was everything. A slow march would arrive too late, or arrive with men too exhausted to fight. A fast march would arrive with men lean and hard and ready. The choice Roberts made next defined the entire character of the operation. He left the heavy guns behind. He left the wheeled transport behind. Every soldier carried 20 to 30 pounds of kit. The rest went on mules, 8,000 animals moving in a column stretching for miles across the Afghan plateau. He packed 5 days of bread, 15 days of dried vegetables, 30 days of tea and sugar. What else they needed, they would take from the country they passed through. The force Roberts assembled was remarkable in its composition. The 92nd Highlanders, Gordon's regiment fresh from hard fighting in the north, the 72nd Highlanders, the 2nd and 5th Gurkhas, the 2nd and 3rd Sikhs, the 9th Lancers for cavalry, 18 mountain guns that could be broken down and carried on muleback across any terrain, 10,000 fighting men and 8,000 followers, cooks, drivers, medical staff, the vast logistical tail that kept a Victorian army moving. On the morning of August 8th, in darkness, the bugles sounded at 1 or 2 in the morning. The reason was simple and brutal. The only way to survive an Afghan summer march was to cover the day's distance before the sun reached its peak. By 4 in the morning, the column was moving. By noon, they had covered their daily distance, typically 15 to 20 miles. Then they stopped, made camp, and waited out the afternoon heat before the cycle began again. The country they moved through tested everything Roberts had prepared. The Logar Valley in the first days was manageable, fertile, with water, and the population cooperative under the new emir's instructions. But as they pushed south, the terrain hardened, the passes climbed. The dust rose in thick red clouds that coated throats and eyes and turned every breath into an effort. The temperature climbed past 40 degrees before noon. Men fell from heat stroke. The sick were loaded onto the few doolies, stretcher litters, that the column carried. Roberts himself fell ill. By the final days of the march, he was being carried in a doolie, running a fever that would have put most men in a field hospital. He refused to be left behind. When the column approached Kandahar, he got back on his horse. He rode into the city upright, in uniform, because his men needed to see him that way. The decision cost him physically. It was the right decision. The numbers that tell the march's achievement are these: 320 miles in 23 days. 15 miles per day, on average, in the Afghan summer, over mountain and desert. The column lost men to heat stroke and illness throughout, but it arrived. On August 31st, Roberts' force entered Kandahar and linked up with Primrose's garrison. The siege was over. The battle was about to begin. Ayub Khan had not waited inside Kandahar to be relieved. When Roberts arrived, the Afghan army had pulled back to the northwest, into the Arghandab Valley, and positioned itself across a rocky spur above the plain. It was a strong position. High ground, natural defensive advantages, 36 guns, including the Armstrong artillery that had wrecked Burroughs' brigade at Maiwand. Roberts spent one day reconnoitring. His scouts came back with a report that told him exactly what he needed to know. Ayub Khan's right flank, anchored on a hill called Pir Paimal, could be turned. The direct approach up the Baba Wali Pass would be costly and slow. The flanking move would put British infantry behind the Afghan position, cutting off the retreat and collapsing the defensive line from within. The plan Roberts issued on the evening of August 31st was straightforward in its ambition and precise in its execution. A diversionary bombardment would fix Ayub Khan's attention on the Baba Wali Pass, while the main infantry force swung left, cleared 2 fortified villages at the base of Pir Paimal, climbed the spur, and came down behind the Afghan main camp. The battle opened on the morning of September 1st. The fortified villages were the first obstacle. Gandhi Mullah Sahibdad and Gundigan sat at the foot of the spur, surrounded by high-walled orchards and mud-walled compounds that had been loopholed for rifle fire. The Afghan defenders had prepared these positions carefully. Taking them would require the kind of close-quarters fighting that casualties come from, moving through compounds, clearing rooms, pushing through orchards wall by wall. The 92nd Highlanders went in first at Gandhi Mullah Sahibdad, with the 2nd Gurkhas alongside them. The combination, Scottish infantry whose aggression under fire had been proved in a dozen campaigns, and Gurkha soldiers whose instinct for close terrain was unmatched in Roberts's army, worked exactly as it had worked before. Compound by compound, orchard by orchard, the village was cleared. At one point, Lieutenant Menzies was cut off and surrounded by Afghan fighters. A drummer and a Gurkha soldier fought their way through to reach him. These are the details that find their way into regimental histories because they are the details that actually happened. In the south, the 72nd Highlanders and the 2nd Sikhs cleared Gundigan with the same aggressive precision. Lieutenant Colonel Brownlow, commanding the 72nd, was killed in the fighting there. The cost was real. The villages fell. With the villages cleared, the infantry moved up the spur. The flanking movement was working. Ayub Khan's position, built to resist a frontal assault from the east, was now being attacked from behind and below. The Afghan artillery could not be repositioned fast enough to bring effective fire on the new threat. By midday, the panic that spreads through an army when its rear is threatened had taken hold. Roberts sent the 92nd Highlanders forward for the final assault on the main camp at Masra. Major George White, who would later be famous for a different siege, at Ladysmith in 1899, led the charge. The Highlanders went in with bayonets. Ayub Khan's camp broke. His soldiers ran. The retreat toward Herat began and did not stop. Among the guns captured in the Afghan camp were the guns Burrows had lost at Maiwand 6 weeks before, the Armstrong artillery that had broken the 66th Berkshires, the pieces that had fired from ranges no British gun could match. They were standing in a captured camp, and British soldiers were walking past them. One Gurkha soldier placed his cap over the muzzle of a captured gun, marking it claimed. The gesture was informal and completely characteristic of how these things are done. In the camp there was also a tent containing Lieutenant Hector Maclean, who had been a prisoner since Maiwand. He was found with his throat cut. It was the shadow that fell across a day that was otherwise, by any measure, a complete victory. The numbers from September 1st are stark in their asymmetry. Roberts lost 40 men killed and 210 wounded. Ayub Khan lost between 600 and 1,500 dead, had 36 guns captured, and his army destroyed as a fighting force. He fled toward Herat and never again threatened British interests in southern Afghanistan. What Roberts had done from beginning to end was this. He had taken a force of 10,000 men, moved them 320 miles across Afghanistan in 23 days of summer heat, arrived fit enough to fight, reconnoitred the enemy position in a single day, designed a flanking attack that negated Ayub Khan's defensive advantages, and executed it in a single morning. The man who had been carried in a dooli by fever for the last days of the march rode back into Kandahar that evening, having won one of the most decisive small battles of the Victorian army. The honours came quickly. Roberts was created a baronet, then a baron. He became Lord Roberts of Kandahar, and the name Kandahar attached to him for the rest of his life, which lasted until 1914, when he died in France at the age of 82, visiting Indian troops on the Western Front. The Kandahar Star, cast from metal captured at Kabul, was issued to every man who made the march. It remains one of the most distinctive campaign medals of the Victorian period, worn by men who had done something that most soldiers are never asked to do. The march and the battle are studied together because they cannot really be separated. The battle was won on August 8th, when Roberts chose speed over weight and committed to reaching Kandahar before Primrose's garrison fell. Every decision after that, the pre-dawn starts, the mule transport, the disciplined daily distances, was the execution of a plan that had already been fixed in Roberts' mind before the first bugle sounded. That's the thing about Kandahar that repays attention. The victory on September 1st was not improvised. It was the final act of a campaign that had been won by preparation, by the selection of the right men, by the refusal to carry anything that would slow the pace. Ayub Khan had an excellent defensive position. What he did not have was an answer to an army that arrived, after 320 miles, still capable of turning his flank. The ridge above Kabul where the march began is a long way from the Arghandab Valley. In between is everything that a British army in 1880 could do when it was asked to do something extraordinary. They did it, and they arrived ready to fight. That is what Kandahar was. If this is the kind of history that moves you, the commanders who made the hard decisions early, the soldiers who covered impossible ground and then fixed bayonets at the end of it, the campaigns where preparation made the difference between disaster and victory, then you know what to do. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The battles that shaped a nation, told the way they deserve.